A man forgotten. Constance checked and double-checked, but there was no convenient bus routes to the address she would be attending for the next few weeks, and inasmuch as a hospital would be covering expenses, Constance took a taxi. Since the daily routine of her life had not required her to visit this part of town before, the closer she got to her destination, the more unfamiliar everything became. The cab driver was not a chatty soul, for which Constance was grateful. She thought about asking him to pick her up at the end of her working day and possibly making this a routine for the next few weeks. But then it occurred to her that she might appear to be too forward, and that might encourage a familiarity she knew would make her uncomfortable, so she said nothing. As the taxi began to slow down, her attention shifted from the new neighborhood she was entering to the fare on the meter in the cab, and she worried a bit about what kind of tip to give the driver. Is it like tipping a waiter? She wondered, and if so, how does one judge the service of a taxi ride? Since the cabbie had driven safely and quietly, she decided to add 10% to the fare and ask for a receipt. When she got out of the taxi and looked at the house she was about to enter, her first thought was, so this is how the other half lives. It was beautiful, even though it was December, and a cold one at that. She could see that the expansive grounds around the place had been well manicured. Constance wasn't sure what size of house could rightly be called a mansion, but it occurred to her that this might be one. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid to enter, but because she was amazed that she was actually the one chosen to work here. Maybe Mr. Halifax believed she was more competent than she had ever realized. She stood for a moment on the front porch, took a few deep breaths, and collected herself the way she always did before she entered the hospital to begin her shift. When she felt in control and competent, she rang the front door and waited, and waited, and waited. She felt a hint of panic. Maybe she was at the wrong address. Maybe something had gone wrong inside. Maybe... From behind her came a voice that startled her. It's not locked, just open the door, and if you wouldn't mind, hold it for me, please. She turned around and saw only a large, fresh-cut fir tree looking a bit like an evergreen missile rocketing toward her. She could only see the legs of whoever was propelling the tree and assumed they belonged to the voice she had just heard. The tree showed no signs of slowing down as it approached the front door, and Constance was afraid that if she didn't open the door quickly, she might be run over. She pulled the storm door open and held it with her foot as she turned the oversized doorknob on the front door. At precisely the same moment she pushed the door open, she felt fresh Christmas tree needles carrying her into the entry of the house. Once inside, she maneuvered her way out of the clutches of the tree and spun free only long enough to watch the flash of green race on into another room. Like a magnet pulling her against her will, she followed the tree. When it stopped, so did she. Thanks. I didn't think I'd make it in without dropping it or breaking something, said the cheerful voice that had carried the tree. Just make yourself at home and I'll be right back. Got to wash the pine sap off my hands. He disappeared into another room before the nurse got a good look at him. Now what was she supposed to do? Making herself at home wasn't something she knew how to do very well in her own place, let alone someone else's. The branches on the evergreen were still bouncing a bit from all the activity, and though Constance didn't notice, so was she. The room she was standing in was from another world she'd never known, nor ever even dreamed of. The high, arched ceilings and paneled walls were tastefully elegant without being opulent. The furnishings were antiques, so perfectly suited to the home that they didn't draw attention to how valuable they must be. Where some rooms in houses that big and beautiful might intimidate their guests, this room made Constance feel, for the first time in her life, as if she were home. But after briefly indulging herself in this newfound warmth, her sense of professionalism, as she liked to think of it, caused her to dismiss her feelings. "Hello," said the carrier of the Christmas tree. "You must be the nurse from the hospital. I'm sorry no one was here to properly greet you, but the butler, housekeeper, valet, and cook was out running some errands, and I wanted so much to get the tree up today, so I went Christmas tree shopping. It took longer than I'd planned to get this beauty, so I'm sorry I wasn't here to welcome you upon your prompt arrival. Please forgive me." Who was this man? The nurse's mind began to race. He couldn't be the aging uncle mentioned in the telegram, could he? He held out his hand. "Everyone calls me Uncle John." Constance prided herself on never staring at anyone. It wasn't polite to stare, but she was staring and couldn't help it. This must be her patient. But he wasn't anything like what she'd imagined. He looked so normal. He wasn't the old geezer she had dreamed about the past night, with saliva trickling from the corners of his mouth and hair growing out of his ears. He didn't have any tics or affectations like those she'd seen in psychiatric patients years before. His eyes didn't have a faraway look she had prepared herself to deal with, and his clothes were beautifully coordinated and comfortably tailored. She couldn't have said why, but she had in her mind that an older man with psychological problems would probably wear chest-high polyester plaid pants, an ugly flannel shirt, slippers, and a ratty robe. His hand was still extended, and finally she shook it. His grip was strong, but gentle. Giving her hand a warm and reassuring squeeze, he held it a bit longer than she wanted, so he could guide her eyes to his when he spoke to her. "You can call me Uncle John. What shall I call you?" "My name is Constance. Constance Louise Chamberlain." As the words left her mouth, she realized she had made a mistake. Her personal professional code demanded that she be friendly, but never familiar. And here she was right off the bat, stating her first, last, and middle names, which she gave only when she had to on official printed material. "Constance, eh? Well, you look like a Constance. But don't feel bad. I can see beyond that. And I believe that all people can recreate themselves if they know where to turn for help. I'll call you Connie Lou." If real life had background music the way movies do, right then you would have heard the kind of music they play when the gunfight is about to begin. Constance's blood was running cold. He had touched a nerve, and she was straining to keep herself in check. How dare he be so critical and so familiar? After all, if anyone needed recreating, it would certainly be him. He was the patient. He was the one with the psychological problems. She recognized that she was losing her professional distance, so she tried to calm herself down before responding. The fact that he was still holding her hand didn't make things easier. "I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself properly in the beginning. Why don't we just call me Nurse Chamberlain or Miss Chamberlain?" She was proud of herself for setting things straight so gracefully and for not losing control. "Well, whenever we call you anything, we'll make sure it's either Nurse Chamberlain or Miss Chamberlain. But as for me, I'm going to call you Connie Lou. You see, if I call you Nurse or Miss or something equally distant and lonely, that's all you'll ever be to me. But Connie Lou, there's someone worth getting to know." Constance wasn't weighing her words anymore. "Sir, this is not a date we're on here. I am a professional, and I don't believe I like the idea of a patient of mine calling me Connie Lou." Uncle John's eyes always sparkled, but the gleam seemed to turn up a notch with each exchange in their conversation. He thought for a moment and then replied, "You're right. It's not fair that I tell you what you can call me, and then turn around and tell you what I'll call you." The nurse didn't think it was visible, but her patient could see the hint of a sigh, part relief, part victory. Then, when she was confident that the matter was settled, her patient said, "You don't have to call me Uncle John, just because everybody else does. Call me whatever you like, and I'll call you Connie Lou." The background music no one could hear had changed from dueling drama to comic farce. Constance Louise Chamberlain recognized what should have been obvious before she got there. This was all a game for this man, and she couldn't take anything he said or did personally. She was dealing with someone who was obviously not in his right mind, or else he wouldn't need a nurse to stay with him. She decided that for the good of Regional Hospital and for the sake of the much-needed gift this patient's family might bring when they returned from Europe, she should play along as best she could. "Very well then," Constance said with a smile born of inner resolve and confidence that she was handling the situation properly. "I'll call you John, or Uncle John if you like. Perhaps we could sit quietly here and get better acquainted." "Very well then. That's a spirit, Connie Lou." Uncle John motioned for Constance to be seated first and then joined her. "What can I tell you about me that you don't already know?" John asked while looking directly at the medical chart the nurse had created for him the night before. "Tell me something, Connie Lou. Do I look crazy to you?" "I mean, really? Wouldn't a crazy person be wearing like chest-high polyester plaid pants, an ugly flannel shirt, slippers, and a ratty robe?" How did he know? How could he possibly have known something she never told another soul in her life? She only thought it, and very privately at that. This was eerie. Constance shook her head and decided it had to be a coincidence because the alternative was unthinkable. "No, John, you don't look crazy to me. But then, I've never been a good judge of crazy people." "Who has?" he responded. "The Marquis de Sade?" John couldn't help but chuckle at his own joke. He half hoped that his nurse would get it and join with him, but she didn't. The little attempt at humor hadn't warmed up Constance at all, as far as John could see, so he pulled back and let her take things at her own pace. In due time, she asked John a question in a voice he recognized as the voice people used to sound professional and dignified. "Why do you believe people think you are crazy, John?" "Because I tell the truth," he said. "And in a world where things false and temporary are worshipped and adored, it's easier to dismiss as crazy those who tell the truth than it is to pay the price of sincerely listening to what they have to say." He said this with no bitterness or disdain for the world his words reproached, but with genuine love mingled with sadness. Before she had a chance to ask any more questions, John stood up, excused himself for a moment, and left the room. When he returned, he was carrying what looked like a very old, relatively small valise fashioned from leather straps and carved wood. Constance had never seen anything like it. She was so preoccupied with the case itself that she didn't ask the question Uncle John was waiting for her to ask. "Don't you want to know what's in here?" he asked with childlike enthusiasm. When she didn't immediately answer, he asked, "These are the most precious possessions I have on earth. These are my Christmas ornaments." Christmas ornaments? The man's most precious possessions were the Christmas ornaments he carried around in an antique suitcase. For Constance, this was evidence enough that her patient belonged in a sanitarium. As if he were preparing the room for someone's arrival, Uncle John went on and on about the ornaments. Each one, he claimed, had a story behind it that he told and retold every Christmas as he placed it on the tree. As he carried on about the contents of his still unopened suitcase, Constance had an odd thought, particularly for someone who never cared much for the fodderall of putting up and taking down Christmas decorations. She thought to herself, there can't possibly be enough ornaments in that suitcase to trim this enormous tree. Maybe he's got another box he'll bring in later. Strangely, Constance had become so caught up in her own thoughts about the ornaments and the tree, she had found herself interrupting John to ask him about the other decorations. "Oh, this is all of them," he told her, patting the suitcase. "Everything you need to trim this big tree is in that suitcase?" she asked incredulously. "That's right." "Then you are crazy." John wanted to give her a hug, but he was afraid she'd misunderstand. So instead, he gave her his warmest smile and said, "Connie Lou, we're going to get along just fine." The opening of the ancient ornament case was a ritual of sorts for Uncle John. He carefully unlatched the cracked leather straps that held the case closed. With each slow and deliberate motion, he seemed to be reliving a memory that was deep and sweet. As he drifted back to other places and other times, he gave life to his memories by humming something to himself. It was a melody Constance didn't recognize.